With all due respect to Bill Starr, I think that all this is about swimming pools or moat. There's a bunch of blather. It sounds like somebody needs to check the library's prostate gland to me. I speak from a certain personal bias on that, but I've already told Bill not to let anybody get between me and the bathroom tonight. But age comes to all of us, and it's a blessing that it does. I have not prepared any talk. I remember so vividly being here before, and what a wonderful group of people you are, and how energized I was by your reaction. So I just thought I'd stand here and open the floor for questions if you have any. And if you don't...
Tell us about your new book.
Oh, all right. The new book is... did you read Bo Emerson's review of it? I thought that was pretty good ink. Coming from a boy who was raised in Buckhead and went to Harvard and done no squat about little towns. And this book is really, it's a diary sort of thing, written for a specific purpose, and it offends me terribly when somebody tells me I read the last chapter first. I didn't write it first. And it's an account of the development of life and progress, and in some instances lack of progress, in a small town, picking up after the Civil War. As some of you people probably heard your parents refer to it, the late great unpleasantness. But most of the people in small Georgia towns, still, when you say before the war or after the war, you know which war they're talking about. And it's not Johnny Comes Marching Home, hurrah, hurrah, that's a Yankee song. And the theme of it is that what makes small towns different is the people who live in them. And it's what we always call characters. And Celestine Sibley and I once got into a discussion about words that really mean the same thing in the South, you know. He's a character, he's a sight, he's a mess, he won't do. But we're losing our characters. And I think with the interstates and it's hard to get on an interstate and know where you are. I mean, it could be anywhere in the United States. It's all getting to be an homogeneous blur, except for these pockets of small towns. And we still have some of that in my hometown of Fayetteville. And I've been very privileged to be exposed all of my life to characters, people who were a mess, or people who were a sight, or people who won't do, and occasionally people who will. But it was a fun thing for me to write. I drew on a lot of personal observations and experiences. I'm frequently asked, well, who is this character? And that's not germane. I am every character. If you're writing and you're developing a character, you have to become that character, at least in your head, until you get through with that one. But I had a good time writing the book. I had fun writing it. I like it, and I hope y'all will. But the jury's still out. I haven't had any reviews except those so far. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Well, first of all, are you a mess or one of those characters?
Yes, ma'am.
But I was just wondering how long it takes you to write one of these, because they seem like
This book took me about a year. Run with a Horseman took 2 years. Whisper of the River took 2 years. When All the World Was Young took 10 years. It was a very difficult book, the third of the trilogy. It was a difficult book to craft, and there was a lot of hop, skipping, and jumping around in it, and pulling it together with a central theme was hard. I published 3 other works while I was writing When All the World Was Young: Christmas Gift, The Widow's Mite, and The Passing. And yes, sir.
I was very interested in your relating your experience about writing the book after you had studied for your boards and gotten used to being up in the morning, and found that you had this amazing sense of recall that you didn't realize how much detail you could recall, and the book, of course, reflects the whole conversation, the whole incidents were just very graphic. Do you still feel that? Still feel that sense?
This is how, when I have this, I think I can't decide whether it's a gift or a curse. But I do. I have a very vivid memory. And my older sister always said that I never let the facts get in the way of a good story. But yeah, I have a very good... One of my mother's sisters, after Run with the Horseman came out, and I didn't know the dear lady could read anything but the New Testament, and but she said, well, if I had known that little rascal was listening to all of that, I never would have said it. But I do have, I've never kept a diary, and there's a good line in this new book, I'm writing it, and it says, I digress, but then I'm a Southerner, I can't help it. My grandfather was a great storyteller. I remember sitting on our front porch after dark. We didn't have radio back in those days, let alone television, and no air conditioning. So you you sat through the twilight and fanned and listened to stories. And he always had to give you the genealogy of every person he was talking about. And I see all those heads nodding. And I guess that's where I picked up the pattern of telling tales. You can't just start telling something about somebody unless you introduce them, make them real. Yes, sir.
Last time I heard you speak was at the Atlanta History Center. I was waiting for When All the World Was Young to come out. You were still writing it. Who was Bill Martin?
He was a figment of my imagination.
Was he in cooperation?
Yes, of about 2. The yin and the yang. But wasn't he a good character? Right. I love my characters.
Sambo?
Yes, sir.
A question from somebody in the closed circuit room.
Yes, sir.
They're asking if you would please tell us a story or 2 that comes from the new book.
Well, I could read one. It gets rather...
We'll get a book for you.
Well, it gets laborious when somebody reads to you. Here's one, Bill.
Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. How many prepubescent members are in this audience? I think I will be daring. I have a granddaughter who graduated from art school, and
They're just trying to steal a book, that's all.
good. But she graduated with a major in art, had not been reading a lot of fiction or anything, and she picked up her father's book that I'd given him, and she told me, "Well, Samby, I'm having to get Dad's book and read it after he goes to bed at night, but said you really hooked me when you talked about Judge Melrose." Let me see if I can find that. Don't even know where it is. If you're going to read salacious, if you're going to recite something salacious, it's much more comforting to read it than it is to tell it. Well,
Is it on page 16?
yes. Who said that? You have a daughter graduated from Georgia? But here again, you'll notice what I'm talking about. It didn't take long for the Cofields to shut down the Bazemore Bank. They burrowed in and just sort of slipped up on the blind side of the Bazemores, who've become as complacent over the years about financial standing as they had about their social status. Sort of like the Romans not paying much attention to the Visigoths until it was too late and they were swarming over the Aurelian Wall. The Bazemores were townfolk, well-to-do, but not what you'd call filthy rich. They mostly ran their bank and, of course, as a result of unpaid loans and foreclosures, had accumulated a considerable amount of farmland out in the county. They were aristocrats and Baptists and hobnobbed with the Lewises, the Robertses, the Mask, and what was left of the Purdue clan. Most of those were female Purdues who had chosen mates judiciously and settled down in the land of their fathers. All those Purdue boys saw Atlanta or even New York City as the promised land and had hauled out of town as soon as they could arrange it. Included in this group of local elite were the Melroses. They were the only Methodists in the upper stratum of Bazemore-dominated society. They were newcomers, so to speak, having moved in only after the federal troops had been pulled out of Georgia. Where Mr. Melrose had come from was a little unclear, but he was the weaker side of that marriage. He was a little bitty man, so pencil-necked that his shirt collars were always too big for him, and he looked like a long-stemmed dahlia stuck down in a bud vase that was too big, except he had only a smidgen of chin, which made his Adam's apple a marvel to behold when he was talking or eating. His wife was the one who attracted attention. She was about 4 inches taller than he, with the aquiline features of a French countess, including the pinched nose, down which she could look most tolerantly. She carried her shoulders squared and had an ample bosom, assuring her femininity. She was regal in bearing, and when she walked, she did not glide, wiggle, or sway. That lady marched, usually about 1 or 2 steps ahead of her husband. She had inherited considerable wealth, and when, because of her noted frugality in dealing with local merchants, I questioned this, my daddy assured me that she was rich as 6 inches up a bull's ass. Any farmer knows that's pretty rich. The irreverent metaphor never quite fit with my vision of this extremely Victorian lady. She had married her one and only suitor, who had read law with an elderly lawyer in Covington and passed his bar exam. They moved into our town, bought a lot right next to Mr. Bud Bazemore's house, and built a fine Victorian house with curved mahogany stair railings and such furniture as was rarely seen. Most of it was uncomfortable. She used a combination of ladylike and financial charms on Mr. Bazemore by inviting his wife to tea and depositing a considerable amount of money in his bank. In no time, Mr. Melrose was appointed Justice of the Peace, and his wife bought a 2-story brick building on one corner of the Bazemore side of the courthouse square, furnished him a downstairs office with hard wooden chairs and an impressive law library, and rented out the upstairs to various tenants. She referred to her husband ever after as Judge Melrose. I still do not know his first name. She confided once to Mrs. Cunningham that Judge Melrose had never seen her feet without stockings on, and it was disgraceful the way these young women were wearing sandals in public and showing their bare toes. I relayed this information in some disbelief to my father, who was a friend of Judge Melrose. Daddy replied laconically, "Son, did you ever fuck a checkbook?" The Melroses had one child. But you see what I mean about small towns needing characters.
Ferrol, for those of us who know you even a little bit, will we find any character in this book that obviously in your first book, it was based on you? For those of us who know you even a little bit knew that. What about this book?
What about it?
Are any of the characters based on you?
On me?
Yes.
Yes.
The narrator?
Ma'am?
The narrator?
Well, a little bit. I do like poetry. The main character here is named Aloysius Holcomb Jr., and it's recounted in there how he earned the nickname of Buster, which was a lifesaver for him. But I think anytime, when you say, is it based on you, let me go back to what I said a minute ago about writing and developing characters. If you really believe in a character that you're portraying, and you may pick somebody that you've seen at a bus station somewhere and don't even know, maybe just saw them or heard them saying something, and you pick up on their speech pattern, you pick up on their appearance, and you describe them. And then when you start ascribing action and whatnot to them, you become that character for a short time. Male or female, doesn't matter, transgender. I did this in a lot in my short stories. In The Widow's Mite, I wrote about 6 of those stories, I think, in the first person female. Had a great experience with the American Psychiatry Association. They invited me to speak. And one lady in the audience, all these psychiatrists were there with their wives. I guess they were their wives. I didn't do any ID check. But one lady, when it was the question and answer time, said, "Well, this story you wrote, Big Star Woman, every sentence in that story ends with a question mark. What's the reason for that?" Well, I looked at her a minute and I said, "Well, I am to assume then that you have never encountered any lady anywhere who spoke like that?" And she said, "Well, no, I haven't. Why did you do it?" And I said, "Well, if you have never encountered that speech pattern, I'd like to be the first person to congratulate you." And she said, "Well, you're not answering my question." And with this, her husband jerked her arm and said, "For God's sake, sit down and shut up." But you become the characters that you write. Porphyria's Lover, which was, I got more bad mail about that story than anything. I think it's the strongest thing I've ever written. But I had a hard time. I started off telling that story in third person. And I wrote about 3 pages, and I said, this is terribly preachy. And I'm going to have to write it in first person. And how could I do this with this character that I wanted to portray? And this was a story that had grown out of some experiences I'd had in my practice. And I wanted it told. I wanted to tell the story. And I decided that I would craft it on Browning's poetry, Porphyria's Lover. And I said, well, I've got to become a sociopath if I'm going to really develop this character. And it sort of alarmed me how easily I slipped into that role. But, yes, sir.
I can't imagine any such thing. What do you do otherwise from doctoring and writing?
Did you say?
What else do you do?
Oh, doctoring. I thought for a desperate moment you said golfing. And I've never been that bored. Well, I had 4 children in 5 years, and the first emergency vasectomy in Georgia. And my first wife is still with me after 59 years next month. And if you will notice, I won! It's better than the lottery. If you will notice, every book I've written has been dedicated to her. The most wonderful person I ever knew. Abraham Lincoln attributed everything to his mama. I lay it on my wife. Yes, ma'am.
Well, since you started writing at a rather late age, had you always felt that you wanted to write, or was this something that came over you, and did you have to write?
Yes. To all 3 questions you asked. I guess the first time I really and truly felt like I could write was when I was a freshman at Mercer University. I was a pencil neck geek, and this is pretty well accurately recounted in Running with the Horseman. That was painfully autobiographical in spots. But I went to Mercer when I was 15 years old. I was carried to Mercer. I had announced that I wanted to go to the University of Georgia, and my father cranked up his car and put me in it and carried me to Macon, which probably saved my life. They're very tolerant down there. But I'd always been a reader. One of the gentleman was asking me about vivid recall, but I remember the first day that it dawned on me that I could read. Baby Ray loves the dog. The dog loves Baby Ray. And most of you all are too young to remember that. Y'all grew up on Dick and Jane and Spot. But I had Baby Ray, and it just, bam, it opened the door. And my folks were poor, but they always had books. Some of them belonged to their grandparents. And there was always the Old Testament to read, which is the most fabulous collection of stories that's ever been published. It ought to be. It's been edited for how many thousand years. But when I went to Mercer, they gave us, one of the first things they did was give you an English placement test. And it was A, B, and C. And A got Dr. Jones. B got Professor Smalley. And C got, I've forgotten his first name, we called him Booby Robinson. And I hit the jackpot. I placed high in it, and I got Dr. Jones. And Dr. Jones was an authority on Shelley, for whom there's, except for the way Mary felt about him, is not a heck of a lot of excuse, but he was a wonderful teacher, and very stern, very demanding, very dignified. I was terrified of him. We had and the course was called Composition and Rhetoric. And twice a week we had to write themes. On Wednesdays you wrote a theme in class. He put titles up on the board and you picked a title and you had an hour to write a theme. On Fridays he put titles on the board and you copied them down and you went to your dormitory room, and we didn't drink beer in those days, and I didn't even smoke cigarettes. And you picked out a topic and you wrote a theme over the weekend. And he graded the hell out of those things. And if you made one comma fault, you flunked that theme. And I never did find out what a comma fault was, but I never made one. I attribute some of that to my devotion to the Old Testament. And I made A's. And he had a rule that you were required to have two quarters of English, freshman English at Mercer. If you made an A in Jones's class the first quarter, you were exempt from the second quarter. Well, I was learning stuff hand over fist. I was learning how to write correctly. And when I would branch out and use my imagination or something, I'd get commended for it. And I was really and truly enthusiastic about this course. I made an A, and he said, "You don't have to come back." Well, I showed up for the second quarter, and he said, "You exempt this?" I said, "I don't want to exempt it. I want to keep on learning." So for 6 months, I wrote 2 themes every week. And at the end of that time, he called me into his office. And you didn't get called into a professor's office at Mercer for any slight occasion. And he said, "Mr. Sams," I'm this high, and my voice hadn't changed. And neither had anything else. I passed all that my sophomore year and made an A in that too. But he said, "Mr. Sams, what do you plan to do with your life?" And I said, "I'm going to be a doctor. I'm going to be a country doctor." And he said, "Very well. I don't want to stand in the way of your ambition. And I've never told many students this, but I think that if you ever changed your direction there, you could probably make a good living writing." Well, I clutched this like the burning coal on Isaiah's tongue for years. And I wrote prescriptions, I mean, I pushed that penicillin. I had 4 kids to raise, and a wife who is high maintenance, but not way up there, but And so finally, I decided that I was getting long in the tooth, and it dawned on me that, inconceivable as it might seem, I was going to die someday, and that if I was ever going to write, I'd better get to work on it. So I started when I was 58, and as the gentleman recalled, it was a very laborious thing. I sat down and started writing. I hadn't written anything since I left Dr. Jones, and it was awful. I wrote about 70 pages, and I said, "What would he say about this?" And I tore it up and started all over. And Bill Emerson, who edited Run with the Horseman, he said, "About halfway through this book, you taught yourself to write." But so I've always wanted to write, and I always wanted to be a country doctor. I always wanted to be a good husband. I always wanted to be a good father. And every now and then, occasionally, I wanted to be a good Christian. My wife was a Methodist, and it didn't take me long to convert. And I left. She introduced me there. You know, you fell in love with this beautiful Philistine princess, and she got you worshiping in the high places. Yes, sir.
When Thomas Wolfe wrote Look Homeward Angel, he had some problems with the people until he became famous. With your three books, have you run into anything like that?
I think that Thomas Wolfe's problems were not limited to that. Who of us in my generation, though, did not love Thomas Wolfe's Look Homeward Angel? But when Run with the Horseman came out, I was absolutely flabbergasted at the reception it received. I thought that, maybe my kinfolks would read it. I thought Helen Elliott was very daring to publish 10,000 books. You ever seen 10,000 books? Lord, that's a lot of books. And all of a sudden, for some reason it hit a nerve, and people loved it. And they gave a reception for me and an autograph party in the Margaret Mitchell Library in Fayetteville, Georgia, which was a little two-room building. It was covered with asbestos shingles. We didn't know about asbestos in those days. And I was sitting there with people that I had known all my life, coming through with these books, and there was a line. It looked like one of Louis Grizzard's lines. I never achieved that later, but in Fayetteville I did. And I sat there in the library with all of these old people coming through who had lived there all their lives, and then the younger people who were even younger than some of them I taught in Sunday school, and they still came. And I sat there in that line, and I looked across the road at Miss Laura Perry's tea room, and I thought, eat your heart out, Thomas Wolfe. Yes, ma'am.
Your comedic timing is perfect. Did you ever desire to be a stand-up comic?
Well, I'm going to quote Bob Steed here, who's one of the best ones I ever heard. He said, if you think I'm funny now, my wife says you should see me without my clothes on. But I carry Christianity to this extreme. I think the most significant thing he said, with all that poop he was wading through, was rejoice. He said rejoice. And if you want to really hold this on down fanatically, if you ain't having a good time, you ain't being a Christian. Yes, sir.
There was a story played out in the newspaper way back in the early 80s, it had something to do with a stuffed cat.
A stuffed cat?
It belonged to you. It was stolen.
Oh, yeah, that was the case of the purloined pussy. I'm sorry. I've got hearing aids.
As I remember, you took your revenge in an interesting way. Can you tell that story?
How did I do that? I finally got the cat back.
You did?
Yeah. It wasn't a stuffed one. It was it was a fake cat. Calico, as I remember. But the way I got it back, I got Ludlow Porch to get on the radio and talk about it, and then the two people that I thought were really responsible for it, we printed up flyers with placards across it, wanted, kidnapping, dispense it, and the business manager of our clinic was the ringleader in that, and I was after him. I nailed him too. And Epiphany. Did you read that story? All right. But then, well, I got him back. But as Jose Williams once said about Jim Miller, don't get in an argument if somebody buys ink by the barrel. But one night, I came home. It was the night after Halloween, and my aged sister-in-law and her husband, we'd been up to our cabin in the mountains, and we came home after dark, and I was driving the sister-in-law, and my wife had the brother-in-law in the car with her. And unfortunately, they were ahead of us, and he'd already had one hernia fixed. And they pulled into the driveway, and it's a long, tortuous driveway to get into my woods and house. And they'd been down to Mickey Harp's place and bought up all of his surplus pumpkins that were not disposed of by Halloween, got them dirt cheap. He was a pinch penny sort of fellow. And but every 5 feet there was a pumpkin, a big pumpkin. Did you ever try to lift one? It's worse than trying to handle a 50-pound watermelon. You can't get a handle on it. But my poor brother-in-law was getting out and moving the pumpkins off the driveway into the woods so that my wife could drive the car in. And we drove in, and I said, well, thank God that's the end of that. But then, when we went in the front door, the pumpkins went all the way down to our bedroom. And when we walked in, there was the grandmother of all pumpkins sitting in the middle of the bed, and perched on top of the pumpkin was the cat. I slept well that night. Yes, ma'am.
Is there any significance to the name Melrose? Because you tell the story in Harmony Ain't Easy.
Yes.
Of Melrose.
Right. I love that name, don't you? And there really are people named Melrose. Right.
I teach a class at a Miller Hospital on Southern authors. And
Where do you teach?
at St. Simon's. And I've been teaching your books and stories for years.
Fletcher, be sure and tell your mother that.
And one question I always get asked is, why is the story of Melrose in the front part? They love the story, but they say, why does he tell this joke, so to speak?
Well, if I was going to have that punchline, that story is accurate. That is no fiction in that story anywhere. That is 100% truth. And any married person will appreciate it. And any person who's not married won't. But I mean, the last line in the story, this horrible accident that has happened and everything. And this story had sort of gotten to be a family shibboleth. And so I never forget my wife. I was bathing in cold water. And I had to bathe. And I was bathing in cold water. I was dying and shivering. And I finally sat down and I had about 2 drinks and wrapped up in a feather comforter, and I quit shaking, and I finally felt like I could go to bed and go to sleep. And my sainted wife said, "You're not mad at me?" And I said, "No, darling, I'm not mad at you." She said, "You sure you're not mad at me?" I said, "No, I'm not mad at you." She said, "Well, in that case, good night, Melrose." I couldn't have come to that without telling the joke. As I said, I digress, but I'm Southern. I can't help it. Somebody back there? Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to know what your favorite books are and who your favorite authors are.
I like Browning. I think he's a wonderful writer. Contemporary, there was a Canadian named Robinson Davies. Have you heard of him? wrote marvelous books. He died about 2 years ago. But he wrote several trilogies. The Deptford trilogy was one. But you read one of them and you're hooked. But he was a marvelous writer. And of course everybody likes Dickens. And it took me about 50 years, but I finally got to where I could stomach Shakespeare without feeling self-righteous. But I guess probably my favorite writers are poets and poetesses. Don't leave Malay out of it.
Who's your favorite contemporary poet?
Who's my favorite what?
Contemporary.
John Stone. You know him? Gosh, what a way he has. Death comes on silently like rust, or suddenly as when you enter a room and the doorknob comes off in your hand. He resonates. Who's yours?
I like Thomas Lux, who's in Georgia Tech right now. He's the poet, has the poet chair at Georgia Tech. Good story.
Georgia Tech has a poetry chair? Next thing you know, Clemson's going to teach a course in writing. Ma'am? Great. They hate each other. My oldest sister read me something one time that she thought was just a hoot. Said, no author lives whose heart does not jump like a gambolling goat in a spring pasture when he reads an unpleasant review of his best friend's latest book. That's amazing. I think that's wonderful. Does any of it rhyme? Try.
But it's a good story.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of like playing tennis without a net, but one of my favorite dead poets is Robert Service.
Yes.
Oh, I mean, he wandered all over the world and all over the page. He and Kipling, they were great.
We have a poetry group in the neighborhood, and more men than women are in the poetry group.
Yeah. What lips my lips have kissed and where and why I have forgotten. Don't leave Malay out.
Dr. Sams.
Yes, sir.
With a little bit of extra water in this auditorium tonight, do you recall any stories that perhaps involve water that you might share with us?
Not at the present time. Give me about 30 minutes. Yes, I can share a story about water with you. I have this sister-in-law that none of us could abide on my wife's side. She mellowed somewhat after the menopause, but she was a tigress when the moon was full. But she's very precise, and she married a good old farm boy who got in the banking business. And the first thing you know, they've got Cadillacs. I mean, they got it. And she aspired to advance her cultural status commensurate with their income and did a fairly good job of it. But and she was always very dignified and very jealous of her dignity. But she endeared herself to me after years of torment by telling me this story. She's very neurotic, as a great many wealthy women are. Poor women can't afford it. She said, Sambo, you know, I went to Tallahassee and had a physical examination about a year ago with this new doctor that had come to town, and I was just absolutely enchanted with him. Said he took up so much time. He was so personally interested in me and my case. And after he had done his physical examination, which was quite thorough, he called me in the office and sat down, and we discussed his findings and everything. And all of a sudden, I realized that it had been over a year since I'd had a physical. So I thought, well, I'll go back to him. I was so favorably impressed. Well, I had to wait 2 weeks to get an appointment. Well, I knew from past experience with physicians that they were going to want a urine specimen. So I just didn't go that morning. And when I got to his office, I was flabbergasted. The waiting room was crowded. It was packed with people, and not all of them well-to-do people. And some of them looked kind of vicious. And the first thing they did when the nurse called me, when I registered, she said, step in the bathroom there and leave a urine specimen. Well, the bathroom opened right off the waiting room. And it was a narrow little thing. All it had in there was a commode and a lavatory with a shelf over it. And when I walked in, there was this whole line of bottles up there with labels on them, with urine specimens, that I guess all those people were going to have to be seen before I was. Well, I had just slung a sweater over my shoulders that morning in case it got cold, and when I swung around to close the door, all those specimens went on the floor. Well, I didn't know what to do. That nurse had not been very pleasant. I did not want to face her. I certainly did not want to open that waiting room door. And I had a very full bladder, so I just put a little in each bottle and set them back on the shelf. So far as I know, no malpractice suit was instituted by that, but I imagine a lot of people got good news about normal urine specimens. Any other questions?
It's such a pleasure to hear you read your own writing. Have you recorded anything?
Yes, I did. And I did this for Helen Elliott on Run with the Horseman. And they did. She knows, you know, she was a musician and a piano teacher before she became a publisher. And she had this wonderful sound studio, and she had me read selected excerpts from Run with the Horseman on 2 cassettes or tapes. And she was so successful with that she had me come back and read the rest of it. So that then she brought out a thing with 4 tapes, with basically is my reading of Run with the Horseman. And for some reason, Peachtree's let it go defunct. You can't buy it anymore, I think. But I've heard it's a great soporific on the road to Savannah. And then they also had me read Christmas Gift. But I haven't. That's out of publication too, I think.
Dr. Sams?
Yes, sir.
Time for just 2 more questions before book signing, please.
All right. Going once? Yes, sir.
What is your opinion on the direction the Southern Baptists have taken in the last 2 years?
I think if the Southern Baptists had not kicked Mercer University out a year or 2 years ago, that they would certainly do it now with the publication of this book. It's amazing. It's amazing how many people want to go to heaven, but they want to go under certain restrictions. I've enjoyed being a Methodist. My mother enjoyed being a Baptist. I had a lady come in one time complaining about her bill, and she had this little pouty mouth. At age 50, she should have gotten rid of that long ago, but she had maintained it. She painted it very cherry red. And she said, Sambo, I want to know why you charged me $5 to see Billy, and you didn't do a thing for him except tell him he was all right. I said, Martha, that was a night call. I saw him at 10 o'clock at night because you and his daddy were scared to death he had polio. And I went out and I examined him, and I couldn't find anything wrong with him. I was perfectly honest. And I said, that's my standard fee for a night call. And if you know, you've got a choice to make here. If this is something that disturbs you and you think it's an unfair charge, I'm perfectly willing to honor your feelings there, and you can find another doctor. Well, that would be a little bit difficult. Since I was the only one that could get out at night. She said, well, that's not the real reason I'm upset with you. It's because you went and joined that old Methodist church. Deal with it. Now, was there one more that Bill said I could take? Yes, ma'am.
Can you give us any words of wisdom in the current political climate?
A, B, C. Anybody but Hillary. That may not be wise, but it's terribly frantic. What do we do now?